Hello and welcome to this Dialogue Web Extra. I'm Marcia Franklin. I'm here with conservationist Shane Mahoney. We're continuing our discussion about the importance of conservation. And one of the things that you write about and speak a lot about is the importance of not forgetting the human in this whole discussion, which sometimes happens.
It does sometimes happen. It's sometimes in the energy and enthusiasm which are brought to these debates, it is possible to see a worldview emerging where people suggest that all we need to do is take human beings out of the equation and everything will be fine. This is what I call the myth that wildlife exists by accident. I mean, wildlife no longer exists by accident anywhere in the world. It only exists by virtue of the decisions we make or do not make. But we have to understand that if one really wants to take a natural view, an ecological view of the planet, then we have to recognize that human beings are one of many species that occupy it. And that our engagements with it will obviously be tension-filled and dynamic, but nevertheless that we do matter. And I have seen what the motivations, the good motivations of good people can do to create a better world. And the last thing we want to do is to alienate people and make them feel that they cannot make a contribution to the conservation of nature if they are users of nature at the same time. That's just not true. One of the things that happens in hunting, for example, which is very hard for people who don't hunt to understand, is that at a certain point in the taking of the life of a sentient creature and consuming that animal, eating that animal, and sharing the meat of that animal with other people, you really do have the completely empirical basis for understanding how the world works. And when you go that far, and it's not an easy decision, it should never be an easy decision, but when you go that far, you begin to understand that at that moment you have a sense of responsibility and an obligation to wildlife that far exceeds anyone else. Every single person who has engaged in that activity, every single one of them who has taken the life willfully of a sentient creature has more of a responsibility to wildlife than anybody else does.
Are hunters hurt, though, by the attention that is paid to the ones who have not done it in that way?
Of
who
course.
Have gone in and poached, taken trophy hunting just for the certain object and not eaten it, or gone and paid to just have an animal parade in front of them and shoot it.
The hunting fraternity and hunting society, the hunting culture, is like every other one. It's made up of a wide diversity of people. I would separate poaching, of course, from hunting because
Sure.
it's a different activity. And with regard to the issue of trophy, I would not classify myself in any sense as a trophy hunter, except that every hunter tries to bring back some memento of the hunt. And for some people that is a full mount of the animal. In some cases it is simply a tooth or a horn or something smaller. So one needs to be, I guess, careful about the nuances that are buried within there. But is hunting hurt by poor behavior? Is hunting hurt by people who hunt but who are callous towards animals? Of course. But anyone who, in my view, anyone who is disrespectful of animals or who mistreats animals in any way, they have an outlook on life that I don't share, and I don't think is to be condoned. But hunting, hunting has thrown up some of the greatest conservation heroes that we have had, both on this continent and elsewhere. It has also exposed some individuals who have had entirely different motivations. And that is a reality that we have to deal with. But there are a lot of people who do not hunt, who may also not have the best of attitudes towards animals. I think they deserve respect. I think they deserve our efforts. For me personally, they have given me so much that to imagine a world without animals is, that would be a definition of hell.
And going back to what you said, there will be no accident with the wild others. They exist because of what we do. That's a big statement. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we make the difference between whether animals live or not.
Absolutely true.
Climate change being part of that.
Absolutely true. Climate change, industrialization, agricultural or forestry practices that are not appropriate. A lot of them are. A lot of them can be modified. But the truth of the matter for the world right now, and everyone needs to recognize it, is wildlife is not an accident. And that's why conservation matters so much. Whether we decide to do the right thing, or we decide to do the wrong thing, or we simply fail to make a decision at all, that will be what influences the fate of wildlife around the world. The oceans, the land, the air, the fresh waters. And history is clear. History is clear that when nations abuse the natural environment in which they live, calamity, difficulty, strife, and conflict arise. We have seen great civilizations rise and fall in the past on the basis of this kind of trajectory. Nothing says that it cannot happen again, and simply because we have improved technology, that does not give us a safety net that cannot be broken. It's a clear choice. We either work to keep them, or we will lose them. There is no other option whatsoever for these wild creatures anywhere in the world, whether it is the elephants of Africa, or the elk of Montana or Idaho, or the codfish of Newfoundland. They all now, their fate rests on tables like these, with human beings like us having discussions of what we will do next. And a really important point about this is that that is not the domain, the purview, the responsibility of only those who are engaged in the conservation movement. Every citizen in every profession has this responsibility, and incredibly, every single citizen in every area of life, in every occupation, has an equal chance to make a difference. Every one of us can do limitless good. There's no boundary on the good we can do for wildlife and wild creatures if we simply commit ourselves to doing it. You can be a rural housewife consumed primarily with raising your children, and you can still do really good things for wildlife. You can be a corporate lawyer who's done extremely well and takes on big cases, and you can do great things for wildlife. You can be a hunter. You cannot be a hunter. You can be somebody who has a difficulty with hunting. You can be any of this. All you have to be is a citizen with a heart, and you can do something good for wildlife.
And as we wrap up, how dire do you feel the situation is these days, based on the decades of work that you've done and your travels? Are we near the precipice?
Well, I would say this, that of almost all regions in the world that I'm aware of, Canada and the United States are probably in some of the most favored positions of all nations. And that's part of the inheritance of our North American model of conservation. But I would also say that it is inevitable now that we will lose a considerable number of wild species in the next decade and the decades to follow, and that we will see in some cases even the iconic animals, the rhino, for example, the lion, species of this nature that almost every child can recognize. We will see those more and more isolated to smaller and smaller and smaller parts of the planet. And it will be a real struggle in many cases to keep them with us in the wild at all. And it will only be through a commitment of nations as a global community that we will stand any chance to forestall these calamities, because we may not even be aware of the final breath taken by a species in Borneo, or for them, an animal in the high Arctic of Canada. People will not necessarily witness this, but people do have a sense of proportion, and they do have a sense of beauty. And, people notice in their own lifetimes whether as many birds sing, or whether they see as many butterflies, or whether they see the same health and vitality in the landscapes that they have grown up in. And every one of those people will tell you in their own way that they sense a personal diminishment in the loss of those things.
And the native cultures are coming forward to talk about what they're seeing and are playing a big role in this as well.
They are, and they have a currency that people find very hard to dismiss. It's interesting that even on the divide over the use of animals and the hunting and taking of animals in whatever form, that there tends to be a collectively different view often towards indigenous peoples, in recognition of the fact that their lives remain closely entwined and directly dependent on wild nature. But if people take just a small step back, they will realize that none of us are very far away from this.
I have the sense that perhaps with media being the way it is, getting smaller and smaller, and social media being what it is, people putting stuff out there, that more and more people will actually see poached animals, animals dying. There was an example recently of an elephant that had taken over when the leader had been poached, and it too was poached. Mm-hmm. And within a very short period of time, there was video of that elephant lying on the ground with game warden. It was dead, but a game warden trying to help it.
Yeah.
And that got out.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, maybe the world will hear more about these events through media.
The social media is tremendous in one way, for exactly the reason you express, in that it can reach so many people and so quickly. A deficit of the social media, in my view, is that it often arrives completely without context.
Sure.
And so it is very difficult for people to understand what might happen. So, for example, someone might see a photograph like that of an elephant that is dead, and maybe a group of people around it butchering it to eat it, and without context they may not really understand that that's very different from what you've just described. We have militias in several regions of the African continent, in several countries there, that are now increasingly using elephant ivory and rhino horn to finance their operations of terror. Just imagine if the debates we were having in Idaho about, conservation involved what do we do about militias who are slaughtering wildlife for sale and wreaking violence and havoc amongst our people. But that's a reality.
Yeah, and you told a story to the wildlife officers the other day that is not a pleasant one to hear, but it's one that you tell and has to do with rhinos, because you feel people need to know the details of what is going on.
I mean, these great animals are being poached. The rhino horn is now one of the most valuable commodities by weight in the world. So naturally, there's a huge market for it. There are cultures that wish to have it, that use it for a variety of purposes, in some cases for traditional medicine purposes, in some cases, however, for sort of the indulgences of the nouveau riche, where people mix a little rhino horn with their wine, or they use it as a hangover cure. And in some cases, these drinks cost $400 a pop to have. But the long chain of reality is that at some point an animal living in the wild environment was approached by people, well organized, lethally equipped, who either shot that animal and then sawed its face off with a chainsaw to quickly extract the horn and get out of there as quickly as possible. And in some cases, of course, the animals are not dead. They've been critically wounded, but they're not dead, and so they experience this trauma and this terror. In other cases,
of having their
faces sawed off.
Sawed off.
And then in some cases they even survive and then have to be killed by wildlife enforcement officials and others. And in some cases now, some of these groups have figured out that why discharge a firearm and attract attention to yourself? Why not just use these immobilizing drugs that we used when we capture wildlife? And they immobilize these animals, and then when the animal cannot react, they saw their faces off with chainsaws, and these animals awaken. They're in horrific pain. They survive for short periods of time with ghastly wounds and eventually have to be killed. I mean, these are some of the scales of problems that people are dealing with. These are not imaginary tales. And that's why I say one of the things that we in North America sometimes just need to step back and say, we are so fortunate to have what we have. We are, in fact, so fortunate to be able to have intensive debates over, how we allocate licenses for elk, or, how in Newfoundland we allocate moose licenses, or what we will do with bears, or what we will do with wolves, or, is climate change really going to affect polar bears, or what should the Endangered Species Act do? I mean, put all of those and add them all together, and then put them on a scale of severity and complicatedness, and see if they will not collectively be far lighter than that one problem that countries in Africa are currently dealing with the rhino.
And people, when they listen to that story, and I watch them, and there was an
visceral
intake of breath, will sometimes think, myself included, well, what can you do? What can you do? Are there groups that you recommend, that you support, that you think are doing a good job, that need money? Which ones do you recommend when people see these type of things and they don't know what they can do from the United States of America to help?
Well, that's the good news on all of this. All over the world, in some of the most unlikely places sometimes, there are people who are working on behalf of wildlife. People of every race and color and religion, nationality, who are desperately working to do their part for wildlife. You have organizations like the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which I'm closely associated with, that does tremendous work around the world in identifying problems and challenges and trying to find solutions and advocating on the basis of science. You have organizations, internationally, like the World Wildlife Fund, for example, that has done, tremendous work with both people and wildlife. Of course, here in North America, there's an enormous array of organizations that have done tremendous things. And in the United States of America, you are literally bursting at the seams with organizations that are trying to do good things for wildlife.
Sometimes it's hard to know.
It's very hard to know.
Which ones are...
And sometimes people make the decision on the basis of a particular philosophy. So if they are a hunter, for example, they tend to support hunter-based organizations. If they're not, they may support others. I wish we could see that dissipate to an appreciable extent. If John Muir, the greatest wilderness prophet in American history and probably one of the greatest wilderness prophets in the world, undoubtedly one of the greatest wilderness prophets in the world, and Theodore Roosevelt, unquestionably one of the greatest conservationists who was a hunter, could have the intense mutual respect and support for one another that they did, and together help launch such influential organizations as the Boone and Crockett Club and the Sierra Club, etc. I think we ought to be able to find a fair amount of common ground, too.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion and for the extra discussion. I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning into this Dialogue Web Extra. You've been listening to conservationist Shane Mahoney. For more information, check out our website, go to idahoptv.org, and click on Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks.